Hello and welcome to the Sheldrake-Vernon Dialogues with myself, Mark Vernon, and Rupert Sheldrake. Hi there, Rupert.
Hello, Mark.
Today thought we would talk, Rupert, about consciousness. Another big term, very current in terms of the science of consciousness, but of course is also very key to how we live and of great interest in spiritual circles, but also more broadly. And Rupert, part of the reason for picking up on this is that actually you just come back from a big science of consciousness conference. So I'm hoping you might be able to give me a bit of a view from the front line on these things shortly. But maybe first, if I just give a little bit of background as to why this is even a kind of problem these days. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, please.
Okay, well, look, to cut to the chase, a phrase that's often bandied around when consciousness is raised is the so-called hard problem. And this is the way that the difficulty of accounting for consciousness, and by that meaning the felt presence and being of our existence, our lives, and then also perhaps self-consciousness as well, the capacity to reflect on awareness, which certainly we human beings have, and presumably other animals have alongside consciousness itself, having a feeling, having a thought, having some kind of will, having comprehension. And this hard problem arises in the modern period, since Descartes particularly. I mean, poor old Descartes, I think perhaps he gets blamed for more than is quite right. Because I think really he's what would be called a dual aspect monist. He actually believes, I think, that there was really only one kind of quality of existence, essence, which is the divine, and then this takes different aspects, which he calls res extensa, the thing that's extended and hence matter, and then res cogitans, the thing that's thought, which would be consciousness. But whatever Descartes himself is or isn't responsible for, certainly this led to a kind of splitting in the period since the 17th century, where it's almost like you're faced with a choice. Either you take the thinking thing, the res cogitans, to be the ontological primitive, the basic stuff out of which the rest of existence flows, or the res extensa, the matter, being the basic stuff, and how it, I don't know whether this is actually a bit more nuanced, but it seems that the dominant paradigm in science would be materialism or physicalism or naturalism. It's given different words depending on how it's defined. Do the natural laws of physics describe everything that's basic, in which case it'd be called naturalism or physicalism, or is that some sort of matter? That's become more complicated since the Einstein revolutions at the beginning of the 20th century and quantum theory, where what's called matter is seen to be a kind of formalization of energy. So an electron would be said to be in a state in a quantum field now, for example. But that would still be held within a physicalist understanding of things, broadly speaking. So this problem has sort of arisen, and it's quite a modern problem, I think. There would be individuals you could point to in the past who might have said that atoms were the basic thing, and the obvious group that comes to mind there would be the Epicureans and the ancient world, following Democritus, who is said to be an atomist. But even then, the atoms of Epicurus could be sort of soul atoms. They could have a kind of vitalist component to them. So it's not really a direct map. And there would still be notions of formal causation, for example, as well as efficient and material. So the idea that which holds all things together has a structure which is held within a kind of mind, and so has a kind of frame that is about relationships, rather than just sort of push and pull of cause and effect, as tends to be thought of now. So I do think this hard problem is probably quite distinctively modern, but because of the hard problem, how can what is most immediate and basic to us, the fact that we are thinking creatures, we have feelings, we have comprehension, we have attention, intention, some sort of willing capacity, and so on. How can you account for this? Becomes this very difficult problem. Now, to come back to where the conference you've just been on, I guess that for most of our listeners, and certainly for the two of us, the hard problem is a sort of mistaken problem in some way, because in some way or other, consciousness is fundamental. But then that does raise other challenges, such as how then you account for the at least appearance of matter, how you account for different kinds of consciousness, how you account for self-consciousness, the fact that we don't immediately at least read each other's minds, we have some sort of independence. How that can be accounted for is interesting in its own respect as well. So I hope that kind of gives a bit of a lie of the land. I don't think anything particularly you want to add to that. And before, what you've been thinking about because of the most recent event you've been to.
The materialist view, of course, says that consciousness is produced inside the brain by the brain's activity. So therefore, it's all inside the head. And so it's a very cerebrocentric view of consciousness. It says that there may be consciousness in human brains, maybe in animal brains. Materialists would differ as to how far in the animal kingdom this might spread. Some would limit it to mammals or fish, or others might extend it to worms. But nevertheless, it's a cerebrocentric view of consciousness. It's in brains. Consciousness is to do with brains. And the whole of the rest of the universe, all the stars, all the galaxies, the planets, everything else in the universe, except possibly forms of biological type life on other planets, is unconscious. So it's a very, very limited view of consciousness. And it's almost the opposite of the traditional view of consciousness in all religions, where consciousness comes first. There's the consciousness of God or some ultimate consciousness exists first of all and gives rise to the universe, the material and physical universe. And so in that view, consciousness is not confined to brains. It underlies everything. And in many traditional understandings of consciousness, which could be called panpsychist or animist, consciousness is present in all sorts of things, not just animals, but also plants, in the stars and the planets. Plato thought that the stars and the planets were, as he put it, visible gods. We still call them by the names of gods, Venus, Mercury, Mars, etc. And that they were conscious beings. And in the Middle Ages, in Christian theology, which was essentially Christian animism, they were still visible gods. So they were guided by the intelligence of angels. So the angels took over from gods as intelligent beings that were guiding certain aspects of nature. And so the idea that there's vastly more consciousness in the universe than just in brains is found in practically every religious tradition, every pre-religious tradition, shamanic traditions. It's just everywhere. And one of the interesting things that's happening now is to try and solve the hard problem. As you know, there's been a rise of panpsychism in academic philosophy, saying, well, we can make the hard problem less hard if consciousness exists to some degree in electrons and protons and atoms and molecules and cells. And by the time we get to something as complex as a brain, then there's more of it. So it differs in degree, but not in kind, from the organization of self-organizing matter. Panpsychists are not usually arguing that everything is conscious. They don't think rocks are conscious. They don't think tables and chairs are conscious, or computers, or socks. They suggest that self-organizing systems may have a degree of consciousness, and that includes atoms, molecules, crystals, cells, plants, animals, stars, galaxies, and so on, but not man-made machines, including computers and smartphones. So that broader view of consciousness then is compatible with the idea that there's consciousness beyond nature as well. If it's just in nature, then you have pantheism, which is that God is nature, nature is God, consciousness pervades all nature, but doesn't transcend it. And but if you have the view that God is in nature, but God also, and the consciousness, divine consciousness, also transcends nature. God is within and beyond nature. God is in nature and nature's in God. Then that's panentheism, which is my own preferred philosophy. Well, at this consciousness conference, it was very interesting to see how these things are playing out. I wasn't there for the whole of it, so I was only there right halfway through. But the tone was definitely one that was open to panpsychism and idealism, the idea that consciousness is fundamental. There were several talks along those lines. I mean, Federico Faggin, for example, gave a talk. His book, Irreducible, is a strong modern argument for idealism from someone who invented the microprocessor and the touch screen. I mean, a lot of the modern technology we use was invented by Faggin. He's an electrical engineer who had a powerful mystical experience which started him thinking about the nature of consciousness. And he has a kind of idealist view that consciousness is primary. And it's not as if this is some ignorant fellow who knows nothing of science. I mean, all scientists use things that Faggin invented, microprocessors. They underlie practically all our modern electronic technologies. So that was one thing. Deepak Chopra was there, slightly surprisingly, and he gave a talk. And of course, his view, based on Hindu philosophy and mystical experience, sees consciousness as primary. Alex Gomez-Marin gave a talk about how he's moved beyond the materialism with which he was educated as a physicist and as a neuroscientist to a much more panpsychist, extended view of the mind. And one of the sessions there was a demonstration of extraocular vision, this remarkable phenomenon whereby especially children can be trained to see things when blindfolded. It seems totally counterintuitive. How can you see things without eyes? But this has now become a rather fashionable area of research. And there are a lot of training programs that train children and some train adults to learn to see with your eyes covered. That's why it's called extraocular vision, vision without the eyes or outside or beyond the eyes. And of course, the obvious objection springs up instantly in everyone's mind. Well, they must be peeping under the blindfold, or they must be sneakily looking out of the corner of their eye or something. But I tried one of these blindfolds on, and I don't think that's plausible. But on the other hand, it's a very mysterious and puzzling phenomenon. But there's an Indian group that trained us. There's a whole Indian organization with a guru who have centers all over the world where they train children to do this. There are other groups in Spain and Mexico and elsewhere who train children to do it. And so there was quite a bit of discussion about that, which was inconclusive because no one knows how you can explain it. I myself gave a talk on morphic resonance about memory in nature and the nature of memory. Anyway, you might from this conference get the impression that the scientific study of consciousness, it was called the science of consciousness. It's been going on for many years in Tucson, Arizona, and in Europe in alternate years. From this conference, there were not many hardcore materialists to be seen. And so you might get the impression that they've somehow gone away or all become idealists or panpsychists. But that impression would be misleading because Stuart Hameroff, who started this conference and organizes it, has always had a broad view of consciousness, an inclusive view that we should include parapsychology, psychic phenomena, broader and mystical experiences, near-death experiences. They're all part of trying to understand consciousness. Well, that upset a lot of the materialists, neuroscientists and others. And I don't think they could stand it anymore. So a few years ago, they set up a rival conference organized by what they call the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. And they were holding a conference at exactly the same time as we were in Barcelona. They were somewhere in Greece holding the rival consciousness conference. And when I looked at their program, it was full of hardcore neuroscience things, brain scans, EEG measurements, hundreds of poster presentations by graduate students, or practically all on sort of hardcore materialist views of consciousness. One of the star speakers was Anil Seth, with whom I had a debate, as you know, in Bergen, Norway, the Holberg debate. The debate was called, "Does Consciousness Extend Beyond Brains?" And he doesn't think it does because he's a materialist. I think it does. So what's happened really is that, unfortunately, that rather than these two schools of thought being together and interacting with each other, they've rather split. And so the materialists have now got their own conference, and I'm sure they'll make sure that, there's no nonsense and mysticism as they see it. And I didn't see anything on their program about psychic phenomena. Maybe there was. I didn't study it very closely. So anyway, the materialists haven't gone away. I would say they're still the dominant school of thought within academic neuroscience. But the debate on consciousness is enlarging. And one interesting twist that I learned from this is that there were several Indians there from Indian Institutes of Technology, and these are prestigious government-funded institutes in India. And they now have, under government law, they have funding for studies of traditional Indian philosophy within Indian Institutes of Technology. And one of them, one group I met from one of the Indian Institutes of Technology, are studying extraocular vision in India, and others were open to studying the sense of being stared at, some of the phenomena I study. And now this is funded in India. I think it opens quite an interesting possibility, because most Indians, of course, do have a very expanded view of consciousness. When I worked in India, I hardly encountered any hardcore materialists. And Indian traditional beliefs are all sort of idealist or panpsychist or panentheist or whatever. Hardly any of them are hardcore materialist in the narrow sense of materialism. So the fact these are prestigious institutions with funding for this kind of research does open up a rather optimistic possibility of serious research on these subjects happening in India, where people have explored consciousness from within through meditation and through yoga for centuries, millennia. But that's normally disregarded by science, even by Indian scientists, until very recently. So I think this is one of the interesting developments I learned about.
Yeah, no, that is very fascinating. I mean, I can see from my own experiences of being in India that when it's much more commonplace to regard consciousness as basic in some way, it gets much easier to actually explore it. You don't have to hive yourself off into a kind of safe zone where everyone has the right assumptions, as you're describing there about the conference in Greece. And it can be more open to exploring the peculiarities even of consciousness that provide a sense, maybe some traction onto what's going on. Could you just say a little bit more on that front? Could you just say a bit more about this extraocular sight? Because I don't think I'd actually ever encountered that before. You say there's different discussions about how it might be accounted for, but is there dispute about how it happens and whether it happens and what's going on and so on?
Well, of course, the skeptics just say it's impossible and they must be cheating. And, there are magicians who might be able to duplicate some of these phenomena. But the people who are training children to do this are doing it not because they're particularly interested in the science of it, but because the Mexican and Spanish schools of extraocular vision training, I mean, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of children have been doing this. It's very widespread. There are groups doing it in England too, but it started in Mexico, this particular school of extraocular vision. And they say that the children become much more confident when they can do something so surprising that impresses adults and their parents and that grown-ups can't do. The people who are best at it are 7-year-olds, apparently, and the ability tends to fall off as children get older. So that's the optimal age for training this, because they don't have intellectual barriers telling them it's impossible. There's also a center in the United States called Vibrovision, which is in Utah, where the guy who runs it, I think he's an ex-martial arts practitioner, or maybe still a martial arts practitioner, have a high-power American training course where grown-ups can go. My friend Alex Gomez-Marin went to it a few weeks ago, and he said it was quite remarkable. After several days, he was able to locate where yellow things were or red things were. They have little bean bags that are red or yellow, different colors on the table, and you learn to just find where they are intuitively and locate objects in front of you. And Alex said he knew he wasn't cheating. I mean, he was completely convinced there was something going on, but he had nothing like the accuracy of these children. I mean, the problem with it was that it seemed too accurate. We had a demonstration from a young Indian girl. Her mother and an Indian professor were with them at the conference, and they said, hold up a picture in front of her, and Jill found a picture on her smartphone, and it was actually of an Indian guru smoking a kind of cigar with a turban and robes and so forth. And this girl described it exactly, the color of the clothes, the fact he was smoking something, the turban, the background. And then they asked me to write a word on a sheet of paper, a whiteboard, and a flip chart thing. And I wrote in capital S the word mouse and put the blue marker pen down. And I said, should I give it to her? She said, no, just put it among the other marker pens. She'll find the right colored pen. And she did. She picked up and then wrote immediately under where I'd written mouse. She wrote mouse. So it was as if she could see completely clearly with her eyes blocked. So, what does one make of this? If there's an ability to see without the eyes, it suggests an ability to pick up information in the electromagnetic field in some completely different way that no one would expect to happen. I got interested in it partly because, as you know, I'm interested in the feeling of being stared at. People can tell when they're being stared at from behind, which is a kind of extraocular vision in a sense that people, without seeing the person, can feel that they're staring, and not only feel they're staring, but know where they're staring from. People turn around and look straight at the person staring at them. So it's a directional ability. So how that works, no one knows either. And the only way I can understand that is through some kind of electromagnetic field around the body. You can't detect the sense of being stared at with the skin, because people can tell when they're being stared at from behind when they're fully clothed. Their neck may be covered by hair. In the winter, outdoors, they're wearing gloves and long coats and stuff. There's no skin exposed. And animals can tell when they're being stared at, even when they're asleep and sort of curled up, and all you see is their fur. Also, in a recent paper I published, you can wake up sleeping people and animals by staring at them when they're asleep. So they're not detecting it by looking or peeping out of their eyes. Their eyes are shut and they're sleeping. So there is some mysterious sense whereby we can pick up when people are looking at us, and also there's extraocular vision, see without eyes. Now, this would obviously be very helpful to blind people, and Alex Gomez-Marin has been investigating a blind man in Spain who has extraocular vision, and it really helps him, obviously. Anyway, it's a profoundly mysterious phenomenon, and it's just one of the things we don't understand about consciousness. And when, in our attempts to understand consciousness, we include, as the Science of Consciousness Conference did include, psychic phenomena, clairvoyance, remote viewing, the sense of being stared at, panpsychism, the consciousness in things that are not human, consciousness of plants as a possibility, near-death experiences, psychedelic experiences, another subject discussed at the conference, and then extraocular vision. You have a mystery, really. I mean, there's so much we just don't know. And idealist philosophers who just say, oh, it's consciousness is primary, that's all very good. But, when you come to phenomena like extraocular vision, they may say, oh, well, of course, consciousness is primary, there's no problem. But there is a problem. I mean, why do we need eyes if we can see without them? So why do animals have eyes, and if they could see perfectly well without them? So there are so many interesting questions, unsolved problems, that my impression from this conference was simply that we're only just beginning to try and understand these things. And all these lines of inquiry have been closed down by materialism in the scientific world for so long. They've just not been explored. You can't explore them within a materialist framework. Oh, and those things on near-death experiences and after-death contacts. I mean, these are all things and survival of bodily death. I mean, these kinds of questions go so far beyond materialism, but we don't have a ready-made alternative explanation that explains them all easily either.
For my interest in all these things, it's one of the reasons why I've been interested in Federico Faggin, actually, because he has a theory based on quantum fields, and I immediately should just put in the proviso that reaching for some sort of quantum explanation when you've only got the very, very, very basic sense of what a quantum field even is certainly running before you can walk. But nonetheless, what interested me is that he seems to be saying that quantum fields exhibit conscious properties, at least. And this has quite interesting ramifications. So I've heard him say that the famous two-slit experiment, for example, which some people in the consciousness first field reach to because they say it's the observer that decides which slit the particle goes through. And he says, no, it's not the observer at all, it's the quantum field itself. And so even within, as it were, seeming allies in the consciousness world, there can be very, very radical differences of view, actually. And that's one of the reasons why Federico Faggin has interested me, because he seems to be saying something very basic, but really quite different from a lot of the people who would reach for experiments like the two-slit experiment to show that having consciousness intention towards material systems makes a difference. So that it's just to underline, I guess, what you're saying there, that there really is everything to play for, everything to try and understand. The good step, I guess, around the consciousness conference that you went to is that it's not already circumscribed by a certain worldview, materialism, but nonetheless, there's still, in a way, all the work to do. So, those who are sympathetic to consciousness coming first shouldn't feel you can just immediately leap from the hard problem being fully in place to more or less everything being solved, which is what you're saying. And so Federico Faggin, he's a very fascinating figure in this area.
Yes, he hasn't tied in his philosophy with traditional philosophy of consciousness very much. And when I read his book, Irreducible Mind, I was struck by the fact he just made it all up himself, in the sense that there are only about 12 references, and most of them are to his own writings. And I was asked to write a commentary on it by somebody, which I did. And I said that much in his book reminded me of the philosophy of Plotinus, the Neoplatonist philosopher, where you have the world soul, and the world soul splits off within itself the souls of individual organized systems. And it was very like Plotinus and some aspects of medieval mystical theology, but he made no reference whatever to this tradition. When I was fascinated during Faggin's talk, when he gave a short autobiographical thing, and he said his father was a professor of philosophy who lectured on Plotinus and Meister Eckhart. But he completely had no interest whatever in his father's view, and as a child, all he was interested in doing was making model aeroplanes and mechanical models and things, and went into engineering because of complete rejection of all that kind of thing. But the interesting thing was that he's reinvented it, and I sort of pointed this out to him, and he hadn't really, I don't think, fully seen how he'd actually, his current philosophy is very much what his father would have been teaching, but expressed in different language.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. And actually, I'm sort of glad to hear it, because one of another reason why what Federico Faggin appeals to me is because he has, to my mind, a much more satisfactory kind of implicit theism, which would be that the one consciousness doesn't have to sort of pull back in order to make space for other finite consciousnesses, which is often a kind of theory you hear. And it's often referenced back to Jakob Boehme, that in order for the one to know itself, it had to become alienated from itself and so on. And you need a subject-object relationship in order to have knowledge and awareness and so on. And I've always found that very unsatisfactory, because it just feels like one finite being trying to understand the infinite as if it's a finite being too, but just a lot bigger. But I think the Neoplatonic tradition, which has this more fractal, would be the modern word perhaps, or holographic sense of the way that the one relates to the many, that the many are as many reflections of the one in finite form. And you get this in mystical traditions like Sufism, where we're said to, where everywhere you look is the face of God, would be a hadith that's often cited. So it's this sense that it's not that there's a kind of pulling back of the one to make some sort of dissociated, isolated consciousness, but rather the many things reflect the one. And so that Neoplatonic tradition appeals to me. So I was very glad that, even if it's unawares, Federico Faggin seems to be channeling something of that tradition.
Yes. He thinks that, Plotinus says that the souls of things within the world soul, which is the soul of the whole universe, within it. So it's forming like a fractal things inside itself, literally inside itself, within the universe. And Iamblichus, who came after Plotinus, one of his students, has a more developed view of how there can be many levels within levels, a kind of holarchy of levels of consciousness, systems within systems. I mean, like cells within tissues, tissues within organs, organs within organisms. He doesn't use those words, but that's the kind of like nested hierarchy of levels. So I think that Faggin's view would be enriched by tying it in with other philosophy, rather than being just sui generis. And actually, it's less sui generis than I thought, given his father's interests. I mean, he may not consciously be relating what he's saying to what his father taught, but it's impossible to believe that he heard nothing of this from his father and it had no impact at all. And he's just independently reinvented the wheel.
I mean, on that analog with the cell, again, just to have one more pass of what Faggin is saying and see how it resonates with you. So I have heard him use the analog of the cell, which is its own distinctive system, but it has within it the DNA that is a representation, at least, of the whole. So within the many cells in the body, the billions of cells in the body, trillions even, is it? It is a fractal relationship, that the many parts are each a reflection of the one whole, and so the whole and the parts relate together, not in a sort of extended hierarchy as if it trickles down with fragmentation, but as in a nested hierarchy, like you're saying, that each level actually contains all other levels, but just expresses it in a particular way. Does that biological analogy hold up for you?
No, it doesn't. Well, you see, the idea, I think Faggin in some ways is quite conventional. I mean, he hasn't thought about every aspect of, he hasn't thought much about biology or about how his philosophy would work for developmental biology or animal instincts or anything like that. And the assumption that DNA contains a representation of the whole body is a kind of conventional biological assumption that DNA is the instructions for the body. Actually, it isn't. It's just what it does is enable cells to make particular proteins, and it has the instructions, if you like, for making all the proteins the body can make, but not for the shape of the body or for the instincts of an animal. I don't think those are inherited through DNA at all. I think they're inherited by morphic resonance. So he doesn't have morphic resonance in his system. He doesn't have memory in his system. So it's very incomplete. I would say it was a first draft, really, of a kind of idealist view from someone who's gone beyond materialism within which he was brought up and in science, and is trying to find a broader view. And he himself is now thinking more about memory and about other things. So what's interesting, you see, is that there are various people coming to this question of consciousness from different points of view, and in dialogue with each other. That's what was going on at this conference. But there's no single model yet that can replace materialism, because there are panpsychists who think that they're basically Spinozan panpsychists, who think that there's no consciousness beyond nature, there's just consciousness within nature. There are panentheists like me who think there's divine consciousness within and beyond nature, and a kind of panpsychist, many levels of consciousness within nature. So there are all sorts of views, and then there's all sorts of empirical areas of inquiry, like out-of-the-body experiences, extraocular vision, and so on.
Can I just ask, maybe as we begin to draw to a close, at least for this time, making a big pass by a big subject, but how does your understanding of morphic fields relate to the bigger question of consciousness?
Well, I think morphic fields shape the structure of consciousness and of minds, and they shape our habits of thought. They're fields of form, but they're not necessarily conscious, because they're mainly habitual, and habits, by their very nature, are unconscious. So morphic fields don't in themselves explain consciousness. They explain habits and repetitive patterns in nature. So one needs a broader theory of consciousness than morphic fields. They underlie consciousness and underlie the structures and ideas in our minds and so forth, but they don't explain consciousness itself. So they're fields within which consciousness exists, but I myself don't have a instant explanation of consciousness in terms of morphic fields.
But I guess where the reason why it falls more into a panentheist or idealistic worldview is that morphic fields are what you might call mind-like rather than matter-like. It's not push and pull in a morphic field. It is it's patterns and so on that are held within a mind-like field, even if it's not actually conscious.
That's right. Well, I mean, we talk about the unconscious mind, and a lot of the mind is unconscious. I mean, the great majority of our mental activity is unconscious. When we've acquired a habit, like speaking a language, we don't need to think about it. I just say what I want to say in English. If I'm speaking Urdu, which I speak also, but I've forgotten a lot of it, I speak slowly because I have consciously to search for the word. And if I speak frequently, it becomes more habitual. So we have so many habits which proceed unconsciously, all our bodily habits, riding bicycles, driving cars, typing things. And so much of what we do is habitual and we don't need to think about it. So morphic fields are mind-like, but they're unconscious mind-like more than conscious mind-like for the most part. And we have to remember, of course, that the mind includes consciousness and what Freud or Jung would have called the unconscious.
Yeah, I rather like the quip. What would be amazing is not if the computer became conscious, but if it had an unconscious life as well.
Yes.
That would be really very surprising. I tell you what, one just more thought I had, if I could put this to you. Another area in which this has been much talked about at the minute is in relation to this podcast series, the Telepathy Tapes. And it presents, this very remarkable evidence. It sounds a bit like extraocular vision, actually, in these severely autistic kids who can't speak. And it's a very good listen, I must say. And you're on the program as well. Inevitably, it's produced a big kickback, and some of it is just completely dismissive, saying that particularly the way that the carers of these children relate communicates information that then presents itself as some kind of telepathy. So that's the sort of the ultra skeptic kickback. But it also feels like maybe there's some sort of middle terrain here, which is that a richer explanation for what's going on isn't going to be a fairly straightforward, simplistic understanding of telepathy on a kind of bilateral level. But there is going to be some sort of triangulated interaction, maybe even involving carers or parents, but that it's pointing to maybe a broader field-like set of relationships that we inhabit. So in a way, neither the simplistic explanation, here's the strong evidence for a simple understanding of telepathy, but also the rebuttal by the ultra skeptic, it's just a sort of form of unconscious cheating. I wonder whether you've thought more about that, and whether actually the whole evidence of the telepathy tapes is pointing us again towards needing a much more sophisticated, nuanced account of maybe a whole range of phenomenon, if we're really going to understand that set of experiences as well.
I think there's no doubt that the relation with the carers is absolutely key in this. And in some of the tests that were done, the carers are there with the child, and the skeptics would say there's unconscious cueing, it's not telepathy. They'd agree there's some kind of communication, but they don't believe in telepathy, so it can't be telepathy for them. But some of the experiments are now being done where there can't be unconscious cueing, where they can't see them, or in separated rooms and so on. So I think that it's not just, I think the skeptical argument is what you'd expect skeptics to say, and it's an important thing to take into account in designing experiments. But people are designing and have designed those experiments. And the first thing any researcher thinks of is these skeptic arguments. Every psychic researcher has internalized these skeptic arguments. It's not as if they naively don't think of this until some sort of sixth former who sort of read the Skeptical Inquirer says they could have been subtle cues, and so they're totally aware of this. But it is about the relationship, and some of these children seem to have telepathic relationships with other children, not their carers, and that's when things get interesting, I think. just as in dreams, where some of the research with dreams shows that people can have shared dreams, they can meet people in dreams and both report the same dream that they've had, a shared dream. Now, if you can have telepathic contact within dreams, then this is all getting very interesting. So I think what this is showing us really is that there's a lot of ways in which minds can be interconnected. There's been very little research on this so far. I mean, the total number of people doing research on these things in the world is, 20 or 30. I mean, it's very, very few people. That's why more funding in India, in these Indian institutes of technology, could make a real difference, because most Indians are motivated to look at these things, because most Indians have a worldview which accepts these things rather than rejects them. The only downside there is that most people take them for granted in India, so they may not be very motivated to try and prove them. Why bother if everyone believes it, But still, what we have really is a situation where there's no clear picture of how consciousness works. We've got several different theories. I think that the tide is turning against the narrow, reductive, materialist approach, and then it's leaving us with a new, open area where it's not at all clear exactly where to go and how everything fits together, or how a phenomena like extraocular vision might be explained. So I think that's really the state of the art in consciousness research at the moment. So much is unknown, and yet the old certainties are melting away.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. That's very sort of fascinating and intriguing, and again, sort of says that there's everything still to do. In fact, there's going to be no simple resolution of these questions. But what is nice is to feel that at least some richer questions are possible to ask, at least in Barcelona, if not in Greece. So yeah, thanks, Rupert. That was very fascinating.
Good, thank you, Mark.